Close your eyes for a moment and let your mind drift back through time. Picture yourself settling into the softest chair you've ever known, wrapped in the warmest blanket, as we begin a journey together through one of history's most fascinating and, yes, rather unpleasant chapters. Tonight, we're going to explore something that every single person who ever lived had to face, yet rarely spoke about in polite company. We're going to discover why medieval toilets were absolutely, utterly, and completely disgusting. But don't worry, this isn't a journey meant to shock or disturb your peaceful evening. Instead, think of it as a gentle exploration of how different life once was, and how grateful we can feel for the simple comforts we enjoy today. As we walk together through medieval castles, peek into peasant cottages, and wander through ancient city streets, you'll discover that understanding even the most basic human needs can teach us profound lessons about resilience, ingenuity, and the slow, steady march of human progress. Imagine, if you will, waking up on a cold morning in the year 1200. The sun hasn't yet painted the sky with its gentle gold, and frost covers the ground like a delicate crystal blanket. You stretch in your bed, feeling the rough woolen covers against your skin, and suddenly you realize something that every person throughout history has realized upon waking. Nature is calling. But in your world, in this time long ago, answering that call would be nothing like the simple, private, clean experience you know today. Tonight, as we explore this hidden corner of medieval life, you'll discover why the most basic human necessity became one of the most challenging aspects of daily existence. You'll learn about the ingenious, sometimes dangerous, and often disgusting ways people solved problems that we rarely think about today. And perhaps most importantly, you'll drift off to sleep with a deep appreciation for the quiet miracles of modern life, and a newfound respect for the countless generations who came before us, making the best of circumstances we can barely imagine. So settle in, take a deep breath, and let's begin this gentle journey back through time, to a world where even the simplest things were complicated, where even the most basic needs required courage, and where the story of human ingenuity reveals itself in the most unexpected places. Before we step into that long-ago world, let's pause for a moment and consider what we're leaving behind. Tonight, if you needed to use the bathroom, you would simply walk a few steps down a hallway, flip a switch that floods the room with clean, bright light, and enter a space that's warm, private, and clean. Fresh water flows at the turn of a handle. Soft paper waits within easy reach. The waste disappears with a simple flush, carried away by hidden pipes to places you never need to think about. Now imagine if all of that simply didn't exist. Imagine if there were no electric lights, no running water, no pipes, no sewers, no toilet paper, and no privacy. Imagine if the simple act of relieving yourself required planning, courage, and often holding your breath. This was the reality for millions of people across Europe during the medieval period. roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries. But here's what's remarkable about human nature. People adapted. They found ways to solve problems, to maintain dignity, and to create systems that, while far from perfect, allowed life to continue. Medieval people weren't any less intelligent than we are today. They simply lived in a world where the solutions we take for granted hadn't been invented yet, where the infrastructure we rely on didn't exist, and where the knowledge we consider basic was still being discovered. In this world, going to the toilet wasn't a private, quick affair. It was an event that required preparation, sometimes tools, often company, and always careful consideration of weather, time of day, and social circumstances. The wealthy had slightly better options than the poor, but even the richest lords and ladies faced challenges that would seem impossible to us today. Medieval people called their toilets by many names: necessaries, houses of easement, garderobes, latrines, and privies. Each term carried its own meaning and suggested different levels of comfort and privacy. But regardless of what they called them, these facilities shared certain characteristics that made them, by our standards, absolutely disgusting. Yet, as we explore these places together tonight, remember that for the people who used them, they represented the best solutions available. Medieval toilets weren't disgusting because people didn't care about cleanliness or comfort. They were disgusting because the alternatives were even worse, and because creating better solutions required knowledge, materials, and infrastructure that simply didn't exist yet. Think about this as you settle deeper into your comfortable bed tonight. Every generation builds upon the discoveries of those who came before. The medieval period wasn't a dark age of ignorance, but rather a time of gradual learning, slow innovation, and human persistence in the face of challenges that seemed impossible to solve. Let's begin our journey in the most impressive buildings of the medieval world, the great stone castles that still dot the European landscape today. Picture yourself approaching one of these magnificent structures on a misty morning. The massive walls rise before you like mountains made by human hands, and flags flutter from tall towers that seem to touch the clouds themselves. From the outside, these castles represent everything we imagine about medieval grandeur, strength, wealth, and power. But as you pass through the great gates and begin to explore the winding stone corridors, you'll discover that even in these palaces of the powerful, the most basic human needs created some of the most challenging problems. Follow me now up a narrow spiral staircase, its stone steps worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The walls are thick and cold, and small windows let in just enough light to see where you're going. As we climb, you might notice a peculiar smell beginning to drift down from above, growing stronger with each step. This is your first clue that we're approaching what medieval people called a garderobe. The word garderobe comes from the French, meaning to guard the robes. This gives us a hint about one of the most surprising aspects of medieval castle toilets. They served double duty. These small chambers weren't just toilets. They were also storage spaces for the castle's finest clothing and most precious fabrics. Now, you might wonder why anyone would store their best clothes in the same room where they relieved themselves. The answer reveals something fascinating about medieval understanding of cleanliness and pest control. Medieval people had noticed that certain insects, particularly moths and other fabric-eating creatures, seemed to avoid areas with strong smells. They believed that the ammonia from urine and the general unpleasant atmosphere of a toilet chamber would protect their valuable woolen cloaks, silk dresses, and fine tapestries from being eaten by insects. Whether this actually worked is questionable, but it shows how people used every space efficiently, even the most unpleasant ones. Now, imagine stepping into one of these garderobe chambers. The room is small, perhaps just 4 feet by 6 feet, with stone walls that seem to press in around you. Along one wall, expensive robes hang from wooden pegs, their rich colors dulled by the dim light filtering through a single narrow window. But it's the opposite wall that demands your attention, because there, built into the stone itself, is a bench with a hole cut through it. This hole, which might be round or square depending on the mason's preference, opens directly to the outside world. And by outside world, I mean it drops straight down the castle wall, perhaps 50, 60, or even 100 feet to whatever lies below. Sometimes that might be a moat, sometimes a river, sometimes just the ground around the castle's base. The waste would fall, guided by gravity alone, to accumulate wherever it landed. Sit with me for a moment on this stone bench and let your imagination fill in the details of what this experience must have been like. The stone is cold, even through your woolen clothing, and rough against your skin. There's no cushion, no comfort, just the hard reality of carved rock. The hole beneath you opens to a dizzying drop, and a cold wind rushes up from below, carrying with it the smells of everything that has fallen before. Privacy, as we understand it, simply doesn't exist here. The door to the garderobe chamber might be nothing more than a heavy curtain, and the sounds of the castle, servants calling to each other, dogs barking, horses neighing in the courtyard below, drift up through the hole beneath you. Sometimes, other people might be waiting just outside, and the social etiquette of medieval toilet use becomes a delicate dance of timing and consideration. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of using a castle garderobe is the constant awareness of danger. You're sitting on a stone bench with a hole that drops straight down the outside of a castle wall. There are no safety railings, no guards, nothing to prevent a person from slipping and falling to their death. Medieval chroniclers occasionally recorded accidents where people fell through garderobe holes. And while these incidents were rare, they were real enough to make every visit a careful balancing act. The construction of these castle toilets reveals both the ingenuity and the limitations of medieval engineering. The builders had to consider the direction of prevailing winds because no one wanted the smell blowing back into the castle's main living areas. They had to think about the castle's defensive needs because a garderobe opening could potentially be used by attackers trying to climb the walls. And they had to balance the practical needs of waste disposal with the structural integrity of the castle walls themselves. In larger castles, multiple garderobes might be built, one above another, sharing the same vertical shaft. Imagine the implications of this design. Waste from the upper floors would fall past the openings of the lower floors, creating a system where timing your visit became a matter of both convenience and personal safety. The servants who cleaned these areas had to be carefully coordinated, and the whole system required a level of planning that we rarely consider today. Some castles tried to improve their garderobe systems by building them over running water. If a castle was built near a river, the builders might construct the toilets so that the waste would fall directly into the flowing water, which would carry it away from the castle. This was considered a luxury upgrade because it meant the waste didn't accumulate directly below the castle walls. But even this solution created its own problems as the river water downstream became polluted, affecting everyone who lived along its banks. The maintenance of castle garderobes was a constant challenge. The walls below the toilet openings became stained and smelly, requiring regular cleaning. The chambers themselves needed frequent attention, as the combination of moisture, waste, and stored clothing created conditions for mold, mildew, and worse. Servants tasked with garderobe maintenance were often among the lowest paid workers in the castle hierarchy. Yet their work was absolutely essential for the health and comfort of everyone living within the castle walls. As dawn breaks over our imaginary medieval castle, let's listen to the sounds that would have filled the air each morning. Picture the stone corridors beginning to echo with the soft pad of feet on cold floors. Servants hurry past, carrying buckets of water and armloads of fresh rushes for the floors. Knights and nobles emerge from their chambers, their faces still puffy with sleep, making their way through the maze of passages toward the garderobes. The sound of heavy wooden doors creaking open and shut punctuates the morning air, along with the occasional splash from far below as waste hits its target. But it's the smells that truly transport us back to this different world. Medieval castles were never what we might call fresh-smelling places. The combination of many people living in close quarters, animals kept within the castle walls, cooking fires, and limited ventilation created a complex bouquet of scents that would seem overwhelming to our modern noses. And rising above all of these everyday smells was the constant presence of the garderobes. A sharp, acrid reminder of the most basic human needs. The medieval nose, however, was adapted to these conditions in ways that ours are not. People who lived in this time didn't have access to the chemical cleaners, air fresheners, and sterile environments that we consider normal today. Their sense of smell was calibrated to a different world, where the absence of truly terrible odors was considered fresh air, and where the presence of natural smells, even unpleasant ones, was simply part of daily life. Medieval people did try to combat the smells in various ways. They burned herbs and spices when they could afford them, scattered aromatic rushes and flowers on floors, and used what we might call medieval air fresheners. Bundles of sweet-smelling plants hung in doorways and windows. But these efforts were like trying to perfume an ocean with a single drop of rose water. The fundamental problems of waste disposal and limited sanitation infrastructure meant that certain smells were simply unavoidable. In the garderobe chambers themselves, some castle builders tried to install primitive ventilation systems. They would create small openings or shafts that would allow air to circulate, theoretically carrying away the worst of the smells. But these systems were crude and often ineffective, especially during certain weather conditions, when the wind might blow the wrong direction, or when rain might drive moisture and smells back up through the openings. The clothing stored in these chambers tells its own story about medieval life. The expensive robes and gowns hanging on their pegs would absorb the chamber's atmosphere, carrying with them a constant reminder of where they were kept. Medieval people became skilled at masking and managing odors through the use of perfumes, herbs, and frequent airing of clothing. But the basic challenge remained. In a world without modern sanitation, even the finest palaces carried the unmistakable scent of human habitation. Now, let's turn our attention to one of the most challenging aspects of medieval castle life: keeping the garderobe systems clean and functional. This was a job that fell to some of the most overlooked and underappreciated workers in the entire castle hierarchy. Yet their work was absolutely crucial for the health and comfort of everyone living within the castle walls. Picture a young servant named Thomas, rising before dawn on a cold winter morning. His job today, as it is every few days, is to clean the castle's garderobes. He wraps himself in his thickest cloak, fills a bucket with water from the well, and gathers the tools of his trade: long-handled brushes, scraping tools, and rags that have been used for this purpose so many times they're permanently stained. Thomas begins his work in the upper chambers, where the lord and lady of the castle have their private garderobe. Even though this is the finest toilet facility in the castle, it still requires regular maintenance. The stone bench must be scrubbed clean, the walls wiped down, and the hanging clothes checked for damage from moisture and pests. The smell in these chambers is concentrated and powerful, and Thomas has learned to breathe through his mouth and work quickly. But the real challenge comes when Thomas descends to the base of the castle to deal with the accumulation of waste, that has fallen from all the garderobes above. This area, sometimes called the gong pit, is where gravity has deposited months or even years of waste from the castle's inhabitants. The smell here is so intense that it can be detected from hundreds of yards away, and the sight is something that would challenge even the strongest stomach. Thomas and his fellow workers must enter this area wearing cloth wrapped around their faces, carrying long-handled tools, and working in shifts because the conditions are so overwhelming. Their job is to remove the accumulated waste, load it into carts, and transport it away from the castle. Some of this waste might be sold to farmers as fertilizer, but much of it simply has to be moved to a location far enough away that it won't affect the castle's inhabitants. The physical demands of this work are enormous. Medieval waste removal was entirely manual labor, requiring workers to lift, carry, and transport heavy loads without the benefit of modern machinery. The health risks were significant too, as workers were exposed to diseases and parasites that thrived in these conditions. Yet this work was essential because without it, the castle would quickly become uninhabitable. The timing of major cleaning operations had to be carefully planned. Castle lords didn't want the disruption and smell of waste removal to interfere with important events, guests, or celebrations. So the worst cleaning jobs were often scheduled for periods when the castle's population was at its lowest, or when weather conditions would help carry away the smells. Some castles tried to improve their systems by building more sophisticated waste management facilities. They might create settling ponds where liquid waste could evaporate, or composting areas where solid waste could break down naturally. But these improvements required significant investment in both construction and maintenance, and many castles simply couldn't afford such luxuries. As we step away from the castle's stone walls and venture into the bustling streets of a medieval city, we discover that the challenges of waste management become even more complex and, frankly, more disgusting. If you thought castle garderobes were unpleasant, wait until you experience the intricate web of urban toilets, public latrines, and waste disposal systems that medieval cities created out of necessity. Picture yourself walking down a narrow street in London, Paris, or any major European city in the year 1300. The buildings rise on either side of you, 3 or 4 stories tall, their upper floors jutting out over the street, so that the passage below is narrow and often dark even in the middle of the day. The ground beneath your feet isn't paved with smooth stones or asphalt, but rather with cobbles, dirt, and things you'd rather not identify. The smell hits you first. It's a complex mixture of wood smoke, cooking food, animal waste, human waste, garbage, and the general mustiness of many people living closely together without modern sanitation. But what makes city smells particularly challenging is their concentration. In a castle, unpleasant odors could dissipate into the open air around the building. In a city, they're trapped between buildings, mixed together, and concentrated in spaces where thousands of people live and work. Medieval cities faced a waste management challenge that was unprecedented in human history. Never before had so many people lived so closely together, and the traditional solutions that worked for small villages or even castles simply couldn't handle the volume of waste produced by urban populations. City governments, guilds, and private individuals all struggled to create systems that would keep their communities livable. But the solutions they developed often created new problems, even as they solved old ones. The most common urban toilet was the cesspit, essentially a large hole dug in the ground, often lined with stone or wood, where waste would accumulate until it needed to be emptied. These pits were usually located in courtyards behind buildings, shared by multiple families and covered with wooden boards that could be lifted when the facility needed to be used. Imagine approaching one of these shared urban toilets on a hot summer day. The wooden cover is warped and doesn't fit properly, allowing flies to swarm in and out. The smell is so intense that you can taste it in the air around you. When you lift the cover, you're greeted by a sight that would make even the strongest person retch. A pit filled with the accumulated waste of dozens of people over weeks or months, buzzing with insects and occasionally moving with the activity of rats and other creatures that have made their homes in this disgusting environment. But this is what you have available, and nature's call cannot be ignored. You position yourself carefully over the opening, trying not to look down, trying not to breathe too deeply, and trying to complete your business as quickly as possible. Privacy is minimal, as other people might be waiting nearby, and the sounds of the city, merchants calling their wares, animals being driven through the streets, children playing, continue around you as you attend to your most basic human needs. The maintenance of these urban cesspits created an entire industry of workers who specialized in waste removal. These men, known by various names, including gong farmers, night soil men, and rakers, had one of the most dangerous and unpleasant jobs in medieval society. They would arrive at night when the smell and disruption of their work would be less noticeable, and begin the process of emptying the accumulated waste from the city's toilets. Let's follow one of these night soil men through a typical evening's work, because their story reveals so much about medieval urban life and the lengths people went to in order to maintain some semblance of sanitation in impossible conditions. Meet William, a gong farmer who works the streets of medieval London. He begins his shift as the sun sets, when the city's residents are settling in for the night, and the streets are emptying of normal daytime activity. William has been doing this work for 10 years, and he's learned to prepare himself, both physically and mentally, for the challenges ahead. First, William wraps cloth around his face, covering his nose and mouth, though this provides only minimal protection against the smells he'll encounter. He dresses in his oldest, most expendable clothes, because everything he wears will be contaminated by the end of his shift. His tools are simple, but essential. Long-handled ladles, buckets, and a cart that he'll use to transport waste to the city's designated disposal areas. William's first stop is a shared cesspit that serves 6 families in a crowded neighborhood. The pit hasn't been emptied in 3 months, and the waste has risen to within a few feet of the surface. As William lifts the wooden cover, the smell that escapes is so powerful that even his experienced nose recoils. But this is his work, and families are depending on him to restore their toilet to working condition. Using his long-handled tools, William begins the process of ladling waste from the pit into his buckets. The work is physically demanding, requiring him to lean over the pit opening and carefully manipulate tools that are heavy and awkward to handle. The waste isn't just liquid. It's a mixture of solid matter, liquid, and things that have been thrown into the pit over the months, sometimes including dead animals, broken pottery, and other refuse. As William works, he has to be constantly alert for dangerous gases that can accumulate in cesspits. Medieval people didn't understand the science of methane and hydrogen sulfide, but they knew that working in these enclosed spaces could be deadly. Gong farmers sometimes died from breathing poisonous gases, and others were overcome by fumes and fell into the pits they were trying to clean. The filled buckets are heavy, and William must carry them to his cart, being careful not to spill their contents on the narrow city streets. A single spill could create a mess that would take hours to clean up and would anger the residents whose doorsteps were affected. The cart itself is a masterpiece of medieval engineering, designed to transport liquid waste without spilling, though the smell it carries follows William through the streets like an invisible cloud. William's route takes him through the sleeping city to designated areas where waste can be disposed of. In London, some waste went into the Thames River. Some was sold to farmers outside the city, and some was simply dumped in areas that were considered far enough away from residential neighborhoods. The city government regulated these disposal sites, but enforcement was often lax, and illegal dumping was a constant problem. The social position of gong farmers was complex and contradictory. On one hand, they performed work that was absolutely essential for urban health and comfort. Without their services, medieval cities would have become uninhabitable within months. On the other hand, the nature of their work made them social outcasts, avoided by other citizens, and often required to live in separate neighborhoods. Yet these workers were also well compensated by medieval standards. The unpleasant and dangerous nature of their work meant that they could command higher wages than many other laborers. Some gong farmers became relatively wealthy, and a few even passed their businesses down to their sons, creating dynasties of waste management specialists who served their communities for generations. The business of waste management in medieval cities reveals fascinating insights into economics, social organization, and human ingenuity. What we might consider simply a disgusting necessity was actually a complex industry that involved multiple levels of workers, government regulation, and even international trade in certain types of waste products. Let's explore how this economy worked by following the journey of waste from the moment it left a person's body until it reached its final destination. This journey involves more people, more planning, and more economic activity than you might expect. And it shows how medieval societies created solutions to problems that seemed impossible to solve. When a merchant family in medieval Paris filled their private cesspit, they would contact a local gong farmer to arrange for cleaning services. This transaction wasn't casual or informal. It was a business arrangement that might involve contracts, payment schedules, and guarantees about the quality of work to be performed. The gong farmer would quote a price based on the size of the pit, the difficulty of access, and the current demand for his services. Payment for these services could take various forms. Wealthy families might pay in silver coins, but many transactions involved bartering goods or services. A gong farmer might accept payment in the form of food, clothing, or other necessities. Some arrangements were ongoing, with families paying an annual fee for regular cleaning services, while others were one-time transactions for emergency cleanings. The waste that gong farmers collected didn't just disappear. It became a commodity that could be sold to different buyers for different purposes. Fresh human waste, despite its unpleasant nature, was actually quite valuable to farmers because it provided nitrogen and other nutrients that plants needed to grow. Gong farmers would often have contracts with agricultural communities outside the city, selling waste by the cartload to farmers who would use it to fertilize their fields. This agricultural use of human waste created an interesting economic relationship between cities and the countryside. Urban waste helped increase agricultural productivity, which in turn provided more food for growing city populations. It was an early example of what we might now call a circular economy, where waste from one sector became input for another sector. The transportation of waste from cities to farms required significant infrastructure and organization. Gong farmers needed carts, horses, and sometimes boats to move their product to distant buyers. They had to coordinate with farmers about timing, because waste needed to be applied to fields at specific times of the year for maximum effectiveness. Weather conditions affected both the collection and transportation of waste, creating seasonal variations in both supply and demand. Some types of waste were more valuable than others. The waste from wealthy households who had better diets and whose waste might contain fewer contaminants could command higher prices than waste from poor neighborhoods. The waste from certain professions such as brewers, whose waste might contain. Medieval cities also had to deal with the problem of waste disposal regulation. City governments needed to balance the economic benefits of waste removal with the health and comfort of their citizens. They created laws about where waste could be dumped, when it could be transported through city streets, and how it should be stored before removal. These regulations created another layer of economic activity, as city officials had to be hired to enforce waste disposal laws, and citizens had to pay taxes to support these enforcement efforts. Fines for improper waste disposal became a source of revenue for city governments, though collecting these fines was often difficult because many violators were poor and couldn't afford to pay. As we leave the crowded, smelly streets of medieval cities and venture into the countryside, we might expect to find cleaner, more pleasant conditions for attending to basic human needs. After all, rural areas had more space, fewer people, and direct access to natural disposal methods. But the reality of medieval rural toilets reveals a different set of challenges, and in many ways, conditions that were just as disgusting as their urban counterparts, though for different reasons. Picture yourself approaching a small farming village on a warm spring morning. The air is cleaner here than in the city, filled with the scents of growing crops, wildflowers, and the occasional barnyard smell of livestock. But as you get closer to the village, you begin to notice something that immediately reminds you that medieval sanitation challenges weren't limited to urban areas. The typical rural toilet was a simple affair, a pit dug in the ground, perhaps lined with stones or rough wood, covered with a basic wooden seat, or sometimes just a plank with a hole cut in it. These facilities were usually located some distance from the main living areas, not because medieval people understood the health risks of proximity to waste, but because the smell and attraction of flies and other pests made it unpleasant to have toilets too close to where people ate and slept. But the simplicity of rural toilets created its own set of problems. Without the relatively sophisticated engineering of castle garderobes or the organized maintenance systems of urban cesspits, rural toilets were often poorly constructed, inadequately maintained, and subject to the full force of changing weather conditions. Imagine using a rural toilet during a heavy rainstorm. The pit might fill partially with water, creating a disgusting soup of waste and rainwater. The wooden seat becomes slippery and dangerous, and the whole structure might be partially flooded. In winter, the situation becomes even more challenging, as the pit might freeze solid, making it difficult or impossible to use, while the wooden seat becomes so cold that contact with bare skin is genuinely painful. The maintenance of rural toilets fell to the families who used them, and this created interesting dynamics within farming households. The job of cleaning and maintaining the toilet usually fell to the lowest-ranking members of the family: children, servants, or elderly relatives who were no longer capable of heavy farm work. This assignment was both a practical necessity and a form of social hierarchy, as the most unpleasant jobs naturally fell to those with the least power to refuse them. So rural waste management became tied to seasonal farming patterns, with waste collected during certain times of the year and applied to fields during specific growing periods. The shared nature of many rural toilets created social dynamics that were different from both urban and castle situations. In many farming communities, several families might share a single toilet facility, which required coordination and cooperation that went beyond simple scheduling. Families had to agree on maintenance responsibilities, cost sharing for repairs, and rules about cleanliness and proper use. These shared facilities also became informal social centers where community members might encounter each other and exchange news, gossip, and information about farming conditions. The toilet became a place where social hierarchies were both reinforced and sometimes temporarily suspended, as the common human need for waste disposal created a kind of equality among users. Among all the medieval institutions that struggled with waste management, perhaps none approached the problem with as much systematic thinking and innovative solutions as the monasteries. These religious communities, with their emphasis on order, cleanliness, and community welfare, developed some of the most sophisticated toilet systems of the medieval period. Their solutions offer fascinating insights into what was possible when intelligent people devoted serious attention to sanitation problems. Let's visit a Benedictine monastery in the hills of medieval France, where the monks have created a waste management system that represents medieval engineering at its finest. The monastery buildings are arranged around a central courtyard, with the church at one end and the living quarters, dining hall, and workshops arranged in a logical pattern that reflects both spiritual and practical considerations. The monastery's toilet facilities, called the necessarium or reredorer, are located in a separate building that's connected to the main dormitory by a covered walkway. This arrangement allows monks to access the toilets without having to go outside during bad weather, while keeping the smells and potential health hazards away from the main living areas. The building itself is a marvel of medieval engineering. Instead of simple pits or holes that drop waste to the ground below, the monastic toilet features a sophisticated system of channels and running water that carries waste away from the building. The monks have diverted a stream to flow beneath their toilet facility, creating a natural flushing system that removes waste continuously rather than allowing it to accumulate. Inside the necessarium, wooden seats are arranged in a row, allowing multiple monks to use the facility simultaneously. This might seem strange to our modern sensibilities, but it reflects the communal nature of monastic life, where privacy was less important than efficiency and shared experience. The seats are built over a channel through which the diverted stream flows, carrying waste away from the building and downstream to a location where it won't affect the monastery's water supply. The monks have also paid careful attention to ventilation, creating windows and air shafts that help remove odors from the building. They've used their knowledge of prevailing winds and seasonal weather patterns to design a system that works effectively throughout the year, even during the coldest winter months, when other toilet systems might freeze or become unusable. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of the monastic approach to waste management is the integration of toilet facilities with other aspects of community life. The monks have created a system where the water that flows through their toilet facility continues downstream to irrigate their gardens and fields. This isn't done carelessly. They understand the need for the waste to be diluted and partially broken down before it reaches areas where food is grown. But it represents a sophisticated understanding of waste as a resource, rather than simply a problem to be disposed of. The monastery's system also includes provisions for solid waste that doesn't flow away with the water. The monks have created composting areas where organic waste can break down naturally, producing fertilizer for their gardens. They've learned to manage this process carefully, turning and aerating the compost to speed decomposition and reduce odors. The maintenance of the monastic toilet system is shared among the community members, with different monks taking responsibility for different aspects of the work. This shared responsibility means that the system is well maintained and that problems are addressed quickly before they become serious. The monks have also created detailed records of their system's operation, including notes about seasonal variations, maintenance schedules, and improvements that could be made. The monastic approach to waste management represents more than just practical problem solving. It reflects a philosophical understanding of human dignity and community responsibility. The monks believed that attending to basic human needs was a form of spiritual service, and that creating clean, functional facilities was a way of honoring both God and their fellow human beings. As we delve deeper into the world of medieval toilets, we must confront the serious health risks and physical dangers that came with these primitive sanitation systems. The diseases, accidents, and long-term health problems associated with medieval waste management paint a sobering picture of daily life in an era when something as basic as using the toilet could literally be a matter of life and death. Let's begin with the most immediate and obvious risk: the danger of falling. Castle garderobes, with their openings that dropped straight down castle walls, presented a constant risk of accidental death. The stone seats were often wet and slippery. The holes were large enough for a person to fall through, and there were no safety features to prevent accidents. Medieval chroniclers recorded numerous instances of people falling to their deaths through garderobe openings. And while these accidents were relatively rare, they were a constant source of anxiety for castle inhabitants. The risk was particularly high for children, elderly people, and anyone who might be weakened by illness or intoxication. Medieval people developed various strategies to minimize these risks. Some castles installed iron bars across the garderobe openings that would prevent falls while still allowing waste to pass through. And users learned to be extremely careful about positioning and balance. But the fundamental danger remained, and using a castle toilet always required courage and concentration. Urban cesspits presented different but equally serious risks. The gases that accumulated in these enclosed spaces could be deadly, and workers who ventured into them to perform cleaning duties sometimes never emerged alive. The medieval world had no understanding of methane, hydrogen sulfide, and other toxic gases that could accumulate in waste pits. But they knew from tragic experience that these spaces could kill. Picture a gong farmer named Robert, lowering himself into a cesspit to clean it manually. The air grows thick and strange as he descends, and his torch begins to flicker and dim. His breathing becomes labored, his vision blurs, and suddenly he collapses, overcome by gases that his medieval understanding cannot identify or explain. His fellow workers, trying to rescue him, might themselves be overcome, creating tragedies that wiped out entire families of waste management specialists. The diseases associated with medieval toilet systems were numerous and devastating. Without understanding of bacteria, viruses, and parasites, medieval people couldn't protect themselves from the health risks that came with constant exposure to human waste. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and countless other illnesses spread through contaminated water supplies and poor sanitation practices. The connection between waste and disease wasn't entirely lost on medieval people. They understood that certain smells and conditions seemed to correlate with illness, and they developed various folk remedies and protective practices. Some people carried small bags of herbs or spices, believing that pleasant scents could ward off disease. Others tried to avoid certain areas during outbreaks of illness, though they couldn't always identify the true sources of contamination. Parasitic infections were particularly common in medieval times, and toilet facilities were perfect breeding grounds for creatures that could infect human hosts. Intestinal worms, skin parasites, and other organisms thrived in the conditions created by medieval waste management systems. People accepted these afflictions as normal parts of life, developing folk remedies and treatments that sometimes helped, but often did little to address the underlying causes. The psychological impact of living with such health risks was profound. Medieval people developed a fatalistic attitude toward illness and death, that we can barely comprehend today. They understood that using a toilet might literally be the last thing they ever did. And this knowledge shaped their daily routines, their spiritual practices, and their relationships with others. Women faced particular challenges in medieval toilet systems. The clothing styles of the period, with their long skirts and multiple layers, made using primitive toilets awkward and dangerous. Women had to manage heavy, cumbersome garments while balancing over holes or pits, often in near darkness and always with the risk of falling or becoming entangled in their own clothing. Pregnancy created additional complications, as women in advanced stages of pregnancy found it increasingly difficult to use toilet facilities that required careful positioning and balance. Medieval midwives and healers developed various techniques to help pregnant women manage these challenges, but the basic problems remained unsolved. Children were particularly vulnerable to the health risks associated with medieval toilets. Their smaller size made them more likely to fall through openings. Their developing immune systems were less capable of fighting off diseases, and their natural curiosity sometimes led them to explore waste areas that adults knew to avoid. Medieval families developed elaborate rules and supervision systems to protect children from toilet-related dangers, but accidents and illnesses were still common. The seasonal variations in health risks added another layer of complexity to medieval toilet use. Summer heat intensified odors and accelerated the growth of disease-causing organisms, while winter cold created different challenges, as waste might freeze and facilities became difficult or impossible to use. Spring flooding could contaminate water supplies and spread waste into areas where it didn't belong, while autumn brought its own set of problems as people prepared for winter months of limited mobility and reduced access to cleaning facilities. The medieval toilet system reveals one of the most fascinating and disturbing aspects of medieval society: how even the most basic human needs were governed by complex social hierarchies that determined who had access to what level of comfort, privacy, and safety. The quality of your toilet facilities didn't just reflect your wealth. It proclaimed your social status, your political connections, and your place in the rigid class structure that defined medieval life. At the very top of this hierarchy sat the royal family and the highest nobility, whose toilet facilities represented the pinnacle of medieval luxury and engineering. Royal garderobes were architectural marvels, built with the finest materials and incorporating the most advanced design features available. These facilities might include multiple chambers, elaborate ventilation systems, and even primitive forms of decoration that made them more pleasant spaces to occupy. Picture the royal garderobe at a major palace, where the king himself might attend to his daily needs. The chamber is larger than most peasant homes, with walls of carefully fitted stone and narrow windows that provide both light and ventilation. The seat itself is crafted from fine wood, perhaps oak or even imported hardwoods, and carved with decorative elements that reflect the monarch's wealth and power. tapestries hang on the walls, not just for decoration, but to absorb odors and provide insulation against the cold stone walls. The royal garderobe might even include a small antechamber where a servant waits to assist the monarch, providing clean water for washing, fresh clothing if needed, and perhaps even entertainment in the form of music or conversation. The waste from royal toilets was often collected separately from other castle waste and disposed of with special care, as even the monarch's excrement was considered to have political significance. But the luxury of royal facilities came with its own set of problems. The elaborate construction made them expensive to maintain, and the multiple chambers and complex ventilation systems created more opportunities for things to go wrong. Royal toilet facilities were often targets for sabotage during times of political conflict, and the servants who maintained them had to be carefully screened for loyalty and discretion. Descending the social ladder, we find the toilet facilities of the lesser nobility, wealthy merchants, and high-ranking church officials. These facilities were comfortable by medieval standards, but lacked the elaborate features of royal installations. They might have well-crafted wooden seats, basic ventilation, and regular maintenance, but they were fundamentally utilitarian rather than luxurious. The middle ranks of medieval society, skilled craftsmen, successful farmers, and minor officials had access to shared facilities that were functional but basic. These might be well-constructed cesspits or simple garderobes, maintained through community cooperation and shared expense. The quality of these facilities varied widely, depending on the prosperity of the community and the effectiveness of local leadership. For the vast majority of medieval people, peasants, laborers, and the urban poor, toilet facilities were crude, uncomfortable, and often dangerous. These might be nothing more than holes in the ground, shared by multiple families, cleaned irregularly, if at all, and located in areas that were inconvenient and unpleasant to reach. The social dynamics around toilet use were complex and carefully regulated. In castle settings, there were elaborate rules about who could use which facilities at what times. Servants might be required to use separate toilets from their masters, and visitors were assigned to facilities appropriate to their social rank. The timing of toilet use was often coordinated to avoid social awkwardness, with higher-ranking individuals given priority access during preferred times. These social hierarchies around toilet use served multiple purposes. They reinforced existing class distinctions by making even the most basic human needs subject to social rank. They helped maintain order in crowded living situations by creating clear rules about access and priority. And they provided a way for the wealthy and powerful to demonstrate their status through the luxury and comfort of their private facilities. The enforcement of toilet hierarchies required constant vigilance and sometimes harsh punishment. Servants who used their master's facilities without permission might face severe consequences, including physical punishment or dismissal. Social climbers who tried to use toilet facilities above their station risked public humiliation and social ostracism. But the system also created opportunities for social mobility and political maneuvering. Skilled craftsmen who built and maintained toilet facilities could sometimes gain access to higher social circles through their specialized knowledge. Servants who managed waste disposal for wealthy families might accumulate enough wealth to improve their own circumstances. And the constant need for toilet maintenance created jobs and economic opportunities that didn't exist in other sectors of medieval society. As we settle deeper into our exploration of medieval toilet life, let's turn to the most intimate and personal aspects of this experience, the details that medieval people themselves rarely discussed, but that shaped their daily routines in profound ways. These are the quiet, private moments that reveal how different life was in an era when even the most basic personal needs required careful planning and considerable courage. Imagine waking up on a cold winter morning in a medieval castle, feeling the urgent need that signals the start of every day. But unlike today, where you might stumble half asleep to a warm, well-lit bathroom just steps away, your medieval morning requires preparation and planning. First, you must dress warmly enough to venture through cold stone corridors to a chamber that will be even colder than your bedroom. You might need to carry a candle or torch to light your way, and you'll certainly need to gather the materials you'll use for cleaning yourself afterward. The question of what medieval people used instead of toilet paper is one that fascinates and horrifies modern minds. The answer varied greatly depending on social class, geographic location, and personal circumstances. The wealthy might use soft fabric scraps, often pieces of linen or wool that had been worn out for other purposes. These fabric pieces could be washed and reused, making them a practical, if not particularly hygienic solution. Common people used whatever natural materials were available: leaves, moss, smooth stones, corn cobs, or even wooden sticks. The choice often depended on the season and the local environment. In summer, large soft leaves like mullein or lamb's ear were popular choices. In winter, people might have to rely on stored materials, like the process of cleaning oneself after using a medieval toilet was time-consuming and often incomplete by modern standards. Without running water, soap, or antibacterial products, people had to make do with cold water from buckets. If they had water at all, many people simply used dry materials and accepted that perfect cleanliness was impossible to achieve. The privacy concerns of medieval toilet use created complex social dynamics that we rarely consider today. In shared facilities, Users had to develop systems of signaling and communication to avoid embarrassing encounters. Some communities used simple signals: a stick placed in a certain position, a piece of cloth hung in a specific way, to indicate when facilities were in use. The sounds associated with medieval toilet use were also a constant source of social anxiety. Without the masking noise of modern plumbing, every sound was audible to anyone nearby. People developed various strategies to minimize embarrassment, including timing their visits to coincide with other loud activities, or using toilet facilities during times when fewer people were likely to be nearby. The physical positioning required for using medieval toilets was often awkward and sometimes dangerous. Castle garderobes required users to balance carefully over holes that opened to dizzying drops. Urban cesspits might have unstable or slippery surfaces that made positioning difficult. Rural toilets were often crudely constructed with rough surfaces that could cause injury. Medieval people also had to deal with the problem of clothing management in ways that we rarely consider today. The long robes, heavy cloaks, and multiple layers of clothing that were standard in medieval dress made using toilets a complex choreography of lifting, arranging, and repositioning fabric. Women's clothing was particularly challenging, as their long skirts and multiple undergarments required careful management to avoid soiling or entanglement. The timing of toilet use was another aspect of medieval life that required careful consideration. People learned to coordinate their bodily needs with their daily schedules, social obligations, and the availability of facilities. Long journeys required planning for toilet stops, and important events might be preceded by careful dietary management to avoid inconvenient needs. The seasonal variations in toilet use created additional complications. Summer heat intensified odors and attracted insects, making toilet visits unpleasant experiences that people tried to complete as quickly as possible. Winter cold made facilities uncomfortable or even dangerous to use, and people might delay toilet visits to avoid exposure to harsh weather. The health implications of medieval toilet practices were profound, but poorly understood at the time. The lack of proper cleaning materials and techniques meant that people were constantly exposed to bacteria and parasites. The contamination of clothing and hands during toilet use contributed to the spread of disease, and the general lack of sanitation created conditions where illness could flourish. Despite all these challenges, medieval people developed remarkable adaptations and coping strategies. They learned to read the signs of their bodies carefully, timing their needs to coincide with optimal conditions. They developed techniques for managing clothing and positioning that maximized safety and comfort. And they created social protocols that helped minimize embarrassment and maintain dignity. Throughout the medieval period, ingenious minds worked constantly to improve the challenge of waste management, creating innovations that were sometimes brilliant, sometimes disastrous, and always revealing of the human drive to solve problems and improve living conditions. These technological experiments show us a side of medieval life that we rarely consider: the constant struggle to create better solutions to basic human needs. One of the most ambitious technological innovations was the development of gravity-fed water systems in some medieval cities. Engineers in places like Paris and London began experimenting with ways to bring running water to urban areas, partly to improve drinking water supplies, but also to help with waste management. These early systems involved wooden pipes, lead channels, and elaborate networks of cisterns and distribution points. Picture the excitement in a medieval city when workers began installing the first public water system. Citizens gathered to watch as teams of craftsmen laid wooden pipes through the streets, connected cisterns to springs and rivers outside the city, and created the infrastructure that would bring running water to public fountains and eventually to some private buildings. The hope was that this flowing water could be used to flush waste from cesspits and latrines, creating a cleaner and more sanitary urban environment. But these early water systems faced enormous challenges. The wooden pipes were prone to rot and leakage, especially when they came into contact with waste materials. The lead pipes, while more durable, were expensive and difficult to work with, using medieval tools and techniques. The systems required constant maintenance, and when they broke down, the results could be catastrophic, flooding streets and buildings with contaminated water. Some medieval engineers experimented with more sophisticated toilet designs that attempted to address the problems of odor, safety, and waste disposal. In certain castles, builders created elaborate ventilation systems that used natural air currents to carry odors away from toilet chambers. These systems involved complex networks of shafts, chambers, and openings that were designed to create airflow patterns that would remove unpleasant smells. The results of these ventilation experiments were mixed. When they worked properly, they could significantly improve the comfort of toilet facilities. But they were difficult to design correctly, expensive to build, and prone to failure when weather conditions changed. A ventilation system that worked perfectly in summer might create terrible downdrafts in winter, actually making odor problems worse. Other technological innovations. Some medieval craftsmen became specialists in toilet construction, developing techniques for creating more stable and comfortable seating arrangements. They experimented with different materials, including various types of wood, stone, and even metal, trying to find combinations that would be comfortable, durable, and safe. The development of improved cesspit designs was another area of medieval technological innovation. Engineers learned to create pits that were better sealed, more efficiently drained, and less likely to contaminate surrounding areas. Some designs incorporated multiple chambers that allowed waste to settle and partially decompose before being removed, reducing the volume of material that needed to be transported. But perhaps the most interesting technological experiments involved attempts to create mechanical solutions to waste removal. Some medieval inventors developed primitive pumping systems that could remove liquid waste from cesspits without requiring workers to enter the dangerous spaces manually. These systems used various combinations of pulleys, levers, and suction devices to move waste from pits to transport containers. The results of these mechanical experiments were often disappointing. Medieval metallurgy and engineering weren't advanced enough to create the precision components needed for effective pumping systems. The pumps were unreliable, difficult to maintain, and often created more problems than they solved. Workers found that it was often easier and more reliable to continue using traditional manual methods, despite their dangers and unpleasantness. Some of the most creative technological innovations came from monasteries, where educated monks had both the motivation and the resources to experiment with improved waste management systems. Monastic engineers developed sophisticated water management systems that used controlled streams to flush waste from toilet facilities. They created composting systems that accelerated the decomposition of organic waste, reducing odors and creating valuable fertilizer for their gardens. The monastic innovations were often more successful than secular attempts at toilet technology because the monks had several advantages. They were educated and could apply scientific principles to engineering problems. They had stable communities that could maintain complex systems over long periods, and they had religious motivations that made them willing to invest time and resources in projects that might not provide immediate economic returns. But even the most successful medieval toilet technologies had significant limitations. They were expensive to build and maintain. They required specialized knowledge that was often lost when key individuals died or moved away, and they were vulnerable to breakdown during times of political or economic instability. Many innovative systems that worked well during peaceful periods were abandoned during wars or famines when resources were needed for more immediate survival needs. The failure of many medieval technological innovations in waste management teaches us important lessons about the relationship between technology and society. Even the most ingenious solutions were limited by the materials, tools, and knowledge available at the time. Social and economic factors often determined whether innovations were adopted, regardless of their technical merits. And the complexity of waste management problems meant that solutions often created new problems, even as they solved old ones. As we near the end of our gentle journey through medieval toilet history, we must consider one of the most profound and rarely discussed aspects of this experience: the psychological and emotional impact of living in a world where basic cleanliness was impossible to achieve, where unpleasant odors were constant companions, and where the most fundamental human needs were sources of anxiety, embarrassment, and sometimes mortal danger. Imagine the mental adaptation required to live in a world where every day begins with the knowledge that attending to your body's basic needs might involve significant physical discomfort, social embarrassment, or even genuine danger. Medieval people developed psychological coping mechanisms that we can barely comprehend today. Ways of accepting and managing conditions that would seem intolerable to modern minds. The constant exposure to unpleasant smells created a different relationship with the sensory world than we experience today. Medieval people learned to breathe through their mouths, to time their breathing, to minimize exposure to the worst odors, and to find small pockets of relatively fresh air in environments that were generally contaminated. They developed the ability to concentrate on other sensory experiences: the feel of sunlight on their faces, the sound of birds singing, the taste of fresh bread, while blocking out the omnipresent smells of human waste. The social dynamics of shared toilet facilities created complex psychological pressures that shaped medieval personality development in ways we rarely consider. People learned to manage embarrassment, to maintain dignity in undignified circumstances, and to navigate social hierarchies, even in the most intimate moments of their lives. These experiences taught lessons about humility, cooperation, and the shared nature of human vulnerability that became integral parts of medieval character. The fear associated with toilet use was a constant presence in medieval life. The knowledge that using a castle garderobe might result in a fatal fall, that entering a cesspit might lead to death from poisonous gases, or that using any toilet facility might expose you to deadly diseases, created a chronic anxiety that modern people can barely imagine. This fear wasn't irrational or neurotic. It was a realistic response to genuine dangers that were part of daily life. Medieval people developed various psychological strategies for managing toilet-related fears. Some turned to religious practices, offering prayers for protection before using dangerous facilities. Others developed elaborate ritual behaviors, specific ways of positioning themselves, particular breathing techniques, or lucky charms that they believed would keep them safe. These behaviors weren't based on scientific understanding, but they provided psychological comfort in genuinely dangerous situations. The impact of medieval toilet conditions on children's psychological development was particularly profound. Children who grew up in this environment learned from an early age that the world was dangerous, that basic needs were difficult to satisfy, and that survival required constant vigilance and careful planning. These early experiences shaped their fundamental attitudes toward risk, safety, and the relationship between individual needs and social cooperation. The shame and embarrassment associated with toilet use in medieval society created psychological patterns that influenced many other aspects of life. People learned to hide their bodily needs, to feel ashamed of natural functions, and to associate basic human biology with social hierarchy and moral judgment. These attitudes had lasting effects on medieval concepts of privacy, dignity, and the relationship between body and soul. The seasonal variations in toilet conditions created psychological rhythms that aligned with natural cycles in ways that modern life rarely experiences. People learned to dread winter months, when toilet facilities became nearly unusable, to anticipate spring cleaning as a time of renewal and improved conditions, and to appreciate summer months despite the intensified odors and pest problems. These seasonal psychological patterns created a deep connection between human needs and natural cycles. The social isolation experienced by people who worked in waste management created unique psychological challenges. Gong farmers, cesspit cleaners, and other waste workers were often ostracized by their communities, despite providing essential services. They developed their own subcultures and support networks. The religious and spiritual dimensions of medieval toilet experience were complex and often contradictory. While some religious traditions emphasized the spiritual importance of cleanliness and purity, the practical impossibility of achieving these ideals created psychological conflicts that medieval people had to resolve. Some found spiritual meaning in accepting and enduring difficult conditions, while others felt that their circumstances separated them from divine grace. The gradual improvements in toilet technology and waste management during the later medieval period created psychological changes that we can track through contemporary writings and records. As conditions slowly improved, people developed new expectations and sensitivities. What had once been accepted as normal became increasingly intolerable, and the psychological adaptation that had allowed people to survive in terrible conditions began to shift toward demands for better solutions. As our journey through the fascinating and often disturbing world of medieval toilets draws to a close, let's settle back into the comfort of our modern world and reflect on the remarkable stories we've discovered together. Take a deep breath of clean air. Feel the softness of your comfortable bed and let your mind wander through the experiences we've shared tonight. We began this exploration in the stone chambers of medieval castles, where even the most powerful lords and ladies faced daily challenges that would seem impossible to us today. We followed the narrow stone staircases to garderobe chambers, where privacy was a luxury, safety was never guaranteed, and basic human needs required genuine courage to address. The cold stone seats, the dizzying drops, the constant smell, and the ever-present danger of accidents created a world where even the most fundamental activities of life carried significant risks. From the castles, we ventured into the bustling, crowded streets of medieval cities, where the challenges of waste management multiplied with every additional person who called these urban centers home. We met the gong farmers and night soil men, whose dangerous and unpleasant work was essential for urban survival, and whose courage and dedication allowed medieval cities to function despite overwhelming sanitation challenges. We explored the economics of waste, the social hierarchies that determined who had access to what level of comfort, and the technological innovations that sometimes succeeded and sometimes failed spectacularly. We walked through rural villages where simplicity brought its own set of problems, where seasonal changes created cycles of difficulty and relief, and where the integration of human waste with agricultural practices created complex relationships between basic needs and food production. We visited monasteries where educated monks applied systematic thinking to sanitation problems, creating some of the most sophisticated waste management systems of the medieval period. Throughout our journey, we've encountered the human stories that make history come alive. The servant Thomas cleaning castle garderobes before dawn, the gong farmer William navigating dangerous city streets with his cart full of waste, the pregnant women struggling with awkward facilities, the children learning to navigate dangerous toilet systems, and the countless ordinary people who faced extraordinary challenges with remarkable resilience and ingenuity. These stories teach us profound lessons about human nature, social organization, and the relationship between technology and civilization. They show us that people in every era have faced basic challenges and found ways to cope, adapt, and gradually improve their circumstances. They remind us that the modern comforts we take for granted, clean water, safe sanitation, privacy, and health, are the result of centuries of gradual improvement, countless small innovations, and the accumulated wisdom of generations who came before us. The medieval period wasn't a time of ignorance or barbarism, but rather an era of gradual learning and adaptation. People worked with the materials, knowledge, and social structures available to them, creating solutions that, while imperfect by our standards, represented genuine progress from even earlier periods. The disgusting conditions we've explored tonight weren't the result of people not caring about cleanliness or comfort, but rather the inevitable consequences of living in a world where the infrastructure and technology for better solutions didn't yet exist. As you drift off to sleep tonight, surrounded by the quiet miracles of modern sanitation, take a moment to appreciate the remarkable journey that humanity has traveled. The clean water that flows at the turn of a handle, the warm, well-lit bathroom just steps from your bed, the privacy and comfort that you consider normal. These represent the culmination of centuries of human effort, innovation, and gradual improvement. But more than that, the stories we've shared tonight remind us of the fundamental resilience and dignity of human beings. The medieval people who faced these challenges weren't so different from us. They loved their families, worked to improve their circumstances, took pride in their accomplishments, and found joy and meaning in their lives despite conditions that would challenge even the strongest modern person. Their experiences teach us about gratitude, resilience, and the importance of not taking our comforts for granted. They remind us that progress is possible, that human ingenuity can solve even the most difficult problems, and that every generation builds upon the work of those who came before. So as you settle into sleep tonight, let your mind rest with the knowledge that you are part of a long human story of gradual improvement, persistent effort, and shared struggle. The challenges that seemed impossible to solve in the medieval period have been overcome through human creativity and cooperation. The problems we face today will likewise be solved by future generations who will look back on our era with the same mixture of understanding and amazement that we feel when we consider the medieval world. Rest well, knowing that you are safe, comfortable, and connected to a remarkable human story that continues to unfold with each passing day. Sweet dreams, and may your sleep be filled with gratitude for the simple miracles that surround us, and hope for the continued progress of human civilization. The disgusting toilets of medieval times have taught us their lessons, and now we can rest in the comfort of our modern world, grateful for how far we've come and optimistic about where we're going. Good night, and thank you for joining me on this gentle journey through history's most unpleasant necessity.